Good afternoon, everyone. Live from Silicon Valley, California. This is Success Sadhana. My name is JM, and I welcome you all to a program today. As you know, Vaish is on a 6-week trip to India for his annual retreat, but he has kindly encouraged us to continue to meet to keep the transcendental vibration going. And I am so excited and thankful that Dhanya Rico is here today. Welcome, Dhanya. Really very, very happy to have you on a program today.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you all.
Yeah, thanks. And for those of you who don't know, Dhanya is a very famous singer, songwriter, and yoga teacher. And she's also a counselor focused on awakening wholeness and transformational healing, especially around marriage and family therapy. So really looking forward to this topic today. I mean, since my family got to know we will be on program, my kids have been very eager. They are in school right now, but I know they have blocked hour later today. As soon as they are back home, they are going to play this program. And we are fan of you, Bali, and your father, Havi. I mean, it's such a exalted musical family and a spiritual family. So really very, very happy that you're here today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that so much.
So, Dhanya, as we discussed, can you walk us through your life story? Like Success Sadhana program that we have is primarily, as Vaish envisioned it, we all want to be successful in our life. And to be successful, we need to have a goal or sadhya or multiple goals in sadhya that we want to fulfill. And then a sadhana or practice needs to be there so that we are putting in the effort required to attain our goal. So, what has been your life story, and and during that journey of life, what are the various goals that life has presented, and what practices or sadhana have you followed, to pursue or fulfill those goals?
Yeah, thank you. It's such an important question, because I think as we journey forward through life, it's important to keep kind of our minds on, why was I doing this again? What was my goal again? Like revisiting the game plan, right? Because it can shift, but hopefully those overarching goals follow us, and then we follow them, so to speak. Yeah, I grew up in a family where the Bhakti tradition was taught. So the tradition of devotion, trying to unite with our divine source through yoga, primarily through mantra meditation. It's a primary practice of that faith. And I had such a mixed experience, because philosophically and theoretically, there was so much information available, almost too much information. I think that from a young age, people who grow up in the Bhakti tradition are exposed to these massive, very profound concepts. And we just kind of, we say these words and we don't really know what it means, like transcendental knowledge or the modes of material nature. And, like you're 6 or 7 years old and you'll say things like modes of material nature, and you have no idea what the modes of material nature when you're, I mean, by experience, but the concept doesn't really land. So I think, I grew up not in any kind of devotional community or spiritual community. I very much grew up kind of in just a modern mainstream community. I went to public schools and I had regular jobs, growing up as like a teenager and a young adult. I went to college for psychology, and then eventually to get my master's degree in counseling. And probably around 15 or 16 years old, I started having a very high contrast experience of being out in the real world, so to speak, and doing all the things that most people do and feeling dissatisfied with that, but also feeling like I had a very shallow understanding of spiritual life. I had a very shallow understanding. I had been exposed to many different spiritual paths because my dad's family is Jewish, my mom's family is Catholic. I had the understanding of the Bhakti philosophy, but all very surface level, all very shallow. And I could feel how unsatisfying that was. I could feel how unfulfilled I was in a spiritual sense, but then just kind of doing the mainstream secular thing and just kind of, chasing money or chasing experiences or developing myself intellectually, they were only mildly satisfying. And even that satisfaction was very temporary. So I came to a crossroads where it felt like I wasn't fully doing material life and I wasn't really fully doing spiritual life. It was very dissatisfying. So I thought, you know what? If I'm going to choose spiritual life, if my teachers are right, if my parents are right, I really need to choose it for myself. It also didn't feel right to just be indoctrinated and do it as a matter of ritual or routine or like social pressure. So my younger brother and I, who right, Omkar? My younger brother and I, we ventured off to India, specifically to the town of Mayapur in West Bengal, which is one of the hubs of studying bhakti because the renaissance of the bhakti tradition took place in Mayapur. And so there's an institute there where you can study, the primary treatise on the bhakti literature, which were presented by Swami Prabhupada. And so we just dedicated some time to like really digging into spiritual literature and really digging into the lifestyle and culture, because when you live in a spiritual place like that, you have a real immersive experience, right? So you're hearing spiritual sounds, you're seeing spiritual sights, you're visiting places of pilgrimage that have in and of themselves their own spiritual vibrational energy. They're kind of like portals to spiritual experience. There are so many teachers available to learn from. And so the combination of the culture, which gave the immersive experience, and really intentionally digging into the literature and reading these books for myself and not just hearing from my dad or hearing from a teacher or hearing from, it really opened my eyes to the relationship I was starting to develop, not just with the author of these books, with Swami Prabhupada, who is, the forefather of all the information that I've been exposed to, but also to the genuine spiritual vibration. Like I needed to contact that for myself. I needed to be able to say a mantra and say, okay, what is happening to me now, or to go and visit a place of pilgrimage or a temple and say, I'm having my own authentic, independent experience. What does that feel like? So, after experiencing that and living in India for almost a year, a lot of things shifted for me. I knew I needed to move from where I was living. I grew up in Venezuela, and things economically and politically were shifting there for the worse, and my studies were interrupted. I couldn't continue my university studies. So I'm sure this has happened to yourself perhaps, and then maybe also the listeners, that once you have a spiritual shift, all of a sudden the universe is shaped differently, and like all your circumstances conspire to kind of push you in this new direction. So that very much happened to me. I just saw my living situation as needing to shift. And, I connected with the person who's now my husband, and our relationship started kind of blossoming. And that really supported my spiritual life a lot. And I'm super grateful for that. So, that lands me here in the US, and I completed my studies, and started my family. And that's kind of where I'm at now. And I'm still chasing that. I'm still chasing what I was chasing in Mayapur, in 2008, it feels like it was 3 years ago, but it's not 3 years ago. Now it's like 14 years ago, which is bananas to think about. But, I'm still chasing that, which is what is my authentic experience. And I realized that for me, especially after living kind of in the mainstream world, and then transitioning and living in a spiritual community, it was very apparent to me that I could not and didn't want to do it in isolation. That isolation is perhaps the worst enemy of the spiritual seeker, because so much of what we learn and so much of what we know and so much of our fortitude in spiritual life comes from the association that we have, the people that we're interacting with. So for me, that meant moving here. I live in North Central Florida in a spiritual community just outside of Gainesville, Florida. So it's right by the University of Florida. And being here allows me to keep up my practices in a regular way. So these practices mean personal kind of private mantra meditation, japa, which happens on counter beads and is sort of a very kind of like inward focused meditation practice. This also means kirtan, which is kind of congregational group community mantra meditation accompanied by musical instruments. It also means reading and studying spiritual literature. It means getting to serve and contribute to my community. That's part of my sadhana too. So I serve specifically on the child protection team, making sure that the kids in our community stay safe and that the community itself gets education regarding how to keep our kids safe and how to raise them as happy, wholesome spiritualists themselves. And it also means I get to be creative and I get to make music, and then whatever I express, hopefully it is also of service. So that's part of what I do as well. And I'm a mom, which I still, every time I say it, I can't believe it. I don't know if that ever goes away. I recently asked my older brother, because he's been a dad for 17 years. So I asked him, I said, everyone, because I had just had my second child like 8 weeks ago. So I told him, I said, every once in a while, I think to myself, I have kids. I'm a mom of 2. And it freaks me out. I can't believe it, And I asked him, does that ever go away? And he said, I hope not. And I thought that was such a great answer. Yeah, I also hope I never stop being kind of pleasantly surprised and slightly horrified that I'm that I'm a parent of 2. But anyways, yeah, so right now, a big part of my service and a big part of my time is given attending to my kids. And that feels really good too. It feels like the culmination of everything that I have learned thus far in my life. Because it's allowing me to teach. And, they say, like, if you really want to learn, you teach. And so I think that it's the right time in my life to be examining what have I really learned, because it's coming out in what I teach my kids. And it's a nice way to stay alert to the things that you want and that you don't want, because the things that I need to improve on, the things that I need to fine tune and polish are also becoming evident in my process of teaching my kids. So it's a very edifying experience, to say the least. I'm sure that because you're a more senior parent than I am, Jam. But yeah, it's wonderful and it's amazing, and it's also totally immersive in the way that Mayapur was in 2008. I'm having a different, but also really exhilarating immersive experience now. So that's that's just a little summary of where I'm at, and and it leads me here. Lucky to be serving all of you and spending time with all of you. So I'm really grateful for that.
Oh, thank you so much, Dhanya, for walking that wonderful journey through. I was, of course, quite excited, surprised to hear about the journey, and you resonated with my own journey as well. And I really like that how you are, how you say that you're still seeking that authentic experience, in the sense that quest that is not finished yet. Yes, you have grown, you have got answers for several of the questions you started with, but you're still seeking, and how that even though you feel like you had everything, but you still did not have, which is like you did not have your personal experience, like what does it mean to me, and not forgetting that, asking that question and going actually to find out for yourself, what does it mean to me, and as having that realization of after having gone through those experiences, getting that realization, because spiritual journey is very personal for everyone, right? We can say what we want, but finally somebody has to actually practice themselves and get their experience, and them for themselves to start having that conviction, that they are, this is what I want to pursue. So seeking that out, and then as you rightly said, it's not in vacuum, as very importantly pointed out. As often mentioned in Bhakti tradition, it's all about association, and what kind of the spiritual association get to. Like even I came into Bhakti because of someone who actually pulled me in. And since then I've cherished the association of all the other Bhakti practitioners, and all my realizations and experience that have been built on top of it. So yeah, and very nicely you brought it down to, like, finally, once you become parent, you really become very mindful. Like, yeah, you have learned or whatever a lot, but finally now it's the time to practice what maybe you have learned, and how well you are, that comes about. So it's a very fulfilling journey that you had so far. Really, and just hearing that makes me so happy. So I just want to maybe open up in case, is there any reflections, anything which anyone would like to share what you've heard so far, in terms of did something like that come about in your life, or did some other questions pop up when you heard Dhanya's story? Please feel free to either type in your chat box or unmute yourself. We'd love to hear from you. Danya, whether we, of course, we are on Zoom, but we are also live on YouTube and Facebook. So I'll be posting questions from all places as and when they come by. Okay, so as we wait for any questions or reflections on chat, Danya, would you want maybe just share some kirtan, or wanted to maybe touch upon the topic of today, mantra for mental wellness? What would you like to do?
Yeah, I think we can just jump right in, and then we can do some kirtan maybe at the end.
Sure, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, as Jam had mentioned, I got my master's degree in counselor education, and that was really, you know, I remember when I graduated, they asked me, many people asked me, you know, so what are you going to do? Are you going to work? Is it going to be private practice? Are you going to? And I remember thinking and also sharing with others that going through the process of learning the things that I learned was so important. There was so much self-reflection that was required for me to move through that process that honestly, if I never practiced a day in my life, it would have been worth it because of what it did for me personally. To have to kind of review these concepts and learn kind of the processes of the mind and the process of the mind and how they affect relationships and how kind of the whole world moves according to these relationships, but that it's really people's minds interacting with one another. You know, that it was so fascinating. It's always been fascinating to me, but to learn it and then to try and apply it to myself so that I could prepare to share that with others and teach others and hold space for others. It was such an incredible experience. So, you know, in doing that, you know, when I was asked to speak at this meeting, I was considering, you know, what's a topic that feels relevant to most people, kind of in that realm. And really what I found is that anxiety and depression seem to be such prevalent elements in today's day and life, more than ever. Part of it is that we now have the vocabulary, we know what anxiety is, or we're more familiar with what anxiety is, and we have, you know, the language to say, you know, these are symptoms of depression and so on and so forth. But I think that the other part of it is that it's becoming aggravated. We are having more people experience anxiety and depression. It's happening on a greater scale, and the severity of it is also increasing. You know, there are some proponents that suggest that maybe anxiety or depression have a genetic component, or that there's some sort of like chromosomal or chemical abnormality. And one of the things that kind of counters that is that it's getting worse in a very short amount of time. And usually like chromosomal or genetic mutations or alterations don't happen in such a short span of time. If you see the statistics of how people are struggling with anxiety and depression compared to like even times of great crisis like World War I or World War II, or, you know, the era of Vietnam, it's actually getting worse over time, and it's a short amount of time. You know, that's to say maybe like the last 150 years. So this kind of indicates that it's circumstantial and that it's psychological more than the fact that it's genetic, which I think that's interesting, because it also means that the ball is a little bit more in our court. Sometimes when we resign things to the realm of genetics, we're like, well, it's genetic, you know, and there's not much that you can do about it. But because we can kind of rise above that strictly biological definition of anxiety and depression, all of a sudden there's a realm of empowerment that we enter again, right? So that's kind of what modern anxiety and depression might feel like. But anxiety and depression themselves are like old as time, since the existence of, you know, life as we know it in terms of the human experience. Anxiety and depression have always been around. And it's interesting to combine spiritual knowledge of why that is with psychological knowledge of why that is, right? So typically when we talk about anxiety and depression, or any kind of these kind of very common forms of suffering, the Bhagavad Gita, which is the foundational text of the Bhakti faith, it begins with a person experiencing severe anxiety, right? Arjuna, who's the protagonist of the Bhagavad Gita, it's who the Bhagavad Gita is being spoken to or spoken with. He's experiencing a crisis in every sense of the word. And it's presenting the way that our crises present nowadays, which is not just my mind and my feelings, but it's also being somatized. Like he experiences trembling and he drops his weapon, which for a warrior is like unthought of. And, so he's experiencing on every level, physically, emotionally, intellectually, even spiritually, a crisis. And that, we're talking about this thousands of years ago, what to speak of nowadays. So it should help us to understand that these feelings have always been around, right? And we have this reference of how spiritualists do or handle anxiety and depression. So, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, who's the speaker of the Gita, he is essentially counseling Arjuna. And in counseling Arjuna, he's saying that, happiness and distress, right? Distress, let's say anxiety and depression, they come and go. They're non-permanent. Happiness, we can all attest to the fact that even the coolest thing that's ever happened hasn't lasted forever. And that's disappointing. But anxiety and depression, although they feel constant, although they feel persistent and pervasive, they're also non-permanent, right? Because they're composed essentially of matter. They're products of the mind, and the mind itself is considered to be a part of the material body that we have as kind of the equipment for interacting in this material world. So the non-permanent appearance of that happiness and of that distress in turn, right? They come and go like the seasons, right? I live in Florida. I can tell you with absolute conviction that summertime feels like it lasts forever, right? I know that there's Northerners and like Canadians and Europeans who are going to tell me that winter lasts forever. And for you, that may be true. I can tell you that winter is like 6.5 days here in January and then it disappears. So winter does not exist for me forever, but summer, it does exist forever. I was actually pregnant all throughout the summer. I was in my last trimester of pregnancy throughout the summer, and it was the eternal summer. It was like 1,000 degrees, and yeah, it was quite intense. So even that kind of summer, right? Even the greatest struggle that we feel, even anxiety and depression as we know it, they are non-permanent. They are non-permanent, and they come and go from our sense perception. Actually, it's the way that we perceive things that creates the experience of suffering, of distress, of anxiety, of depression. And it's a little bit difficult to talk about it strictly in these terms, because when one is suffering, for someone to tell you, it's just your perception of things, it's not exactly that way. Things are as they are, and you're just perceiving them as, anxious or sad or, whatever. This is something that we should apply to ourselves, right? And what it does by taking this yogic perspective as presented in the Bhagavad Gita, right? What we're learning to do is not reverse anxiety and not reverse depression. Way before we can start improving or shifting or changing, it's tolerating, right? We tolerate or create an awareness of or sit with, right? Create presence around our suffering. And when I sit with something, when I create that space where I can actually look at my anxiety, I can look at my depression, I can look at negative self-talk or any of these other things that might be plaguing me at this time, I start to create a little bit of breathing room between what I'm thinking and me as the observer. And this is where the money's at, so to speak, right? This is the place that I'm trying to get to when I work with people one-on-one or with couples. We're trying to get to the place where I think things are a certain way. And as long as I'm inside of that bubble, then that's how things are for me. Now, if I can just remove that, not even in full conviction of this is not who I am, but as an experiment in what if this is not who I am? What if these are thoughts, but I am not my thoughts, right? What if I am an observer and my mind is a separate entity, is a separate experience? In creating that space, That's what tolerance is. It means I'm not trying to shift it. I'm not trying to manipulate it, right? Because we also learn in the Gita that attachment and aversion are two sides of the same coin. If I'm very, very in my story, that's going to be a problem. But if I'm very much trying to push or suppress or move away from my story, that's also going to be a problem, because it's still this big expenditure of energy, right? There's one author who talks about, his name is Gabor Mate, and he talks about how depression, even though it feels very low energy in terms of the fact that it presents as lethargy, apathy, a lack of, they call it anhedonia, which is I don't enjoy things as I normally do. It feels very kind of down here, but actually depression, he describes it like trying to keep a beach ball underwater, right? You're trying to depress that beach ball, but it takes an enormous amount of energy to do it. Right? So depression, it's an enormous amount of energy that's being expended to keep something down, and it's exhausting, right? So if I'm trying to do this is aversion. If I'm trying to be hiding or submerging a part of my experience or negative thoughts, or whatever it is, or something that made me afraid, or some form of trauma, which is usually the root of this anxiety and depression, it's going to be just the opposite side of the coin, right? And so if we look at it from that perspective, it validates our experience of anxiety and depression. And this is really important from a yogic perspective as well, because the yogi understands that anxiety and depression are actually perfectly normal coping mechanisms. They're perfectly normal coping mechanisms because I'm dealing with a material world that is by nature a little problematic. Right? And I say by nature in the strictest sense of the word, because when we talk about material nature, we're talking about primarily three energies. There's the energy of goodness or light, the energy of passion or creation, and the energy of darkness. And so these energies, according to our understanding from the Gita, it's also constantly in flux, constantly combining and recombining and dissolving and recreating. And so these constantly shifting energies that are like mind-boggling, inconceivable, and are configuring and reconfiguring all the time, it's a form of chaos, right? And if there's something that we understand about the material world, also kind of found in our Bhakti literature, it's that by nature, matter is impermanent. Right? And so that impermanence creates a big dilemma for us. It feels unstable. It feels chaotic. It creates fear. It generates fear, not on a conscious level, like a walk around, afraid during the day. On a deep kind of existential level, it creates fear. And so fear from the very beginning of our lives, right? From babyhood, like my, 8-week-old son, fear generates anxiety. Fear generates sadness. And so anxiety and depression are actually really real experiences. They're real, they're authentic experiences, but they're considered to be coping mechanisms that actually are helping us deal with a problematic world, a world, especially that in modern society translates to isolation, exploitation, and ultimately it's coming from a lack of knowledge of the self. Right? Because if I'm afraid, it's because I don't have knowledge of any form of safety. I have no ground with which to kind of balance myself. I have nothing to stand on, right? This kind of instability that I feel, it's an accurate read on the material world. It's actually an excellent assessment of my situation, right? My response is generating suffering, right? Because they're expressions of fear. So this intuitive sense that this instability is incompatible with my nature, that's kind of our deepest identity speaking. Our deepest identity says this temporality, this instability, kind of the modes of nature coming and going and combining and things being impermanent, and it doesn't feel right. And so the yogis, they argue that it doesn't feel right because the nature of our true selves, the nature of our soul, is eternal. We're supposed to be eternal. We're supposed to be full of knowledge, and we're supposed to be joyful. So anytime that those three qualities are seemingly challenged by our immersion in the material world, we're going to come up against anxiety and depression in a myriad of expressions, right? So what I'm trying to say with all of this is that from the yogic perspective, anxiety and depression actually make perfect sense. They make perfect sense. And so it's important to kind of look at it from that perspective because it validates our experience. And there's no way that we're going to be able to address what's going on in terms of our mental wellness and proceed in our spiritual life if the things that are causing us suffering are not first observed and validated, right? So we want to kind of get to that jumping point, which is everything that you're feeling makes a lot of sense. Even when it generates suffering, even when it's difficult, it's something that makes sense. Does that sound okay for you guys? I don't know if maybe anybody has any thoughts or anything that they want to share in terms of that. Usually that kind of stirs the pot a little bit, especially for people who have been questioning, what anxiety or depression might mean for them, or might experience maybe some shame around anxiety and depression. That's a very common experience. I don't know if maybe anybody has any reflections on that.
Yeah, there are a couple of people, I think Jenny, RP, did you have anything to say? I think we received a collection of question on chat. I'm just trying to pull that up. So just give me a second. It's from Linda. Linda, she says, I can remember having anxiety from as young as 5 years old, and it has continued throughout my life. As you mentioned, the world has become more complicated and sad, and my anxiety seems to be worse the last few years. I use multiple tools to deal with my daily struggles, meditation, breathing, etc. But some days I get to a point where I literally feel paralyzed and cannot put forth effort to try to heal myself. When this happens, should I stay calm and feel, or should I work to push and keep myself busy?
Yeah, it's such a great question, right? Because you want to reach for those tools. You want to be able to use the things that you know are helpful for you. But at the same time, there is that paralysis, right? It's like a feeling of helplessness, perhaps, that we've experienced. And that's, it can be quite frightening, actually. So usually when I work with people, I ask them to rate, like on a Likert scale is what it's called, on a scale from 1 to 10. 10 being a full on, kind of panic attack level anxiety where you feel like it's fully taking over your body and you're truly kind of like paralyzed or inhabilitated physically. And 1 being, this feels very manageable. I feel very level headed. Where are you at on a scale from 1 to 10? And usually what I advise people is once you start creeping up to like a 7 or 8, you shouldn't be alone. Right? There's a principle of self-regulation, which is the things that I do on my own that I know kind of keep me balanced and keep me centered. And then there's also a symbiotic principle of co-regulation. We're social beings by nature. We're community members by nature. Even if society is somehow conspiring for its own purposes to kind of keep us isolated in these pockets where we're so busy that we actually don't contact other people, co-regulation is a crucial part of mental wellness. And if that piece isn't there, you can have all the self-care you want, you can have all of the tools and read all the books and have all of the personal practices that might be uplifting. But when push comes to shove, there is a piece that needs to include other people and other people's support. And this is actually really helpful. And I'll tell you why, for 2 reasons. One is other people's presence nourishes us in a way that we're not able to provide ourselves. And this harmonizes very well with bhakti, because bhakti bases its practices almost entirely in community settings. The second piece of why this is important is because by co-regulating, I'm allowing myself access to tools that are outside of my wheelhouse, so to speak. I'm diversifying coping mechanisms by onboarding other people, helping me, talking me through things, or even physically just being around somebody else, being in a safe space where I feel someone else's presence that feels very grounded, right? Being with somebody who can make good eye contact with me and have open body language and speak in a tone that feels reassuring, even if we're not talking about the problem or the anxiety or whatever's coming up for me, just to be in the presence of another person whose energy field is very grounded, that can be healing. And that's not something I'm going to be able to self-generate. So it's important to note that the severity of what I'm experiencing, as it increases, I should seek to be around somebody else. Okay, so your first move, once it starts getting really bad, and you can kind of feel when that wave is cresting, right? When it's going from like manageable anxiety to like maybe it's feeling a little bit wobbly, and then all of a sudden it feels like it's really getting unmanageable, and I'm starting to get that paralysis. When you observe what your normal pattern is, right? Because anxiety has patterns. There's like a shape to it, just like depression has a shape to it. Once you kind of self-reflect, and you can do this through journaling or talking with friends and so on, once you start watching that pattern of what tends to happen right before the wave crests, you can catch yourself in that moment and say, you know what, I need to go outside for a second. I need to call a friend. I need to contact a mentor. I need to be with other spiritual practitioners, or I need to go and meditate, but in a group setting. I need to attend a kirtan, right, which is group meditation. I need to be around other people. And so this could be reaching out to a counselor as well, attending group therapy, attending a 12-step group, right? Any of these places where I know that I will be supported by other people, and that their energy, especially in person, which we can do now as like life normalizes a bit after the whole COVID situation, to be around other people is going to be what helps restore me back to that like 6 or 7 and under on a scale from 1 to 10. Does that make sense? I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, Lila, just thank you so much, Danya. I definitely tend to isolate when this happens. So I appreciate the insight to try and be with others.
May I add something, JM, too?
Please go ahead, Lila.
Thanks. Danya, I feel like there's so much reflection I'm doing in all the words you're saying, but I just wanted to add, sometimes when I need to reach out to somebody because I'm in one of those upward crest anxiety moments, right? If I connect with someone and then they're having a harder time, it totally pops me out of my anxiety, which also helps.
Okay.
You know, because then you have to, well, you don't have to, but then, right, you try to also help with that person's anxiety, and I guess it changes where I am mentally, so it also helps me step back from my own internal spiral.
Yeah, I mean, that's brilliant. It's so brilliant. I'm so glad that you brought it up, because it's a testament to how kind of pre-programmed our anxiety and our depression tends to be. It follows a very strict pattern, right? And this pattern is considered to be a feedback loop in the negative sense, right? A feedback loop meaning as soon as I have the anxious thought, my body starts experiencing anxiety. That reads in my mind as, wow, there really is a problem. And so then I keep generating anxious thoughts about my anxiety. And then that creates further, and we're talking on a somatic level, this is really activating you. It's not like just a mental thing. This is activating your push of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. It might be pushing your adrenals. It's going to be kind of kickstarting this cycle of problematic thoughts, problematic feeling in my body, then my problematic thoughts increase, then the surge in my body increases. And so it begins this. So when we talk about, you know, in the realm of wellness, when we talk about breaking out of that, if you imagine a feedback loop, right? Like that infinity sign, which is kind of like an 8, but sideways. As soon as you break open that feedback loop, what you've done is anything different. It doesn't even have to be an awesome thing. It's literally just doing anything different. Oh, I've stepped outside. I've taken deeper breaths. I've called a friend. Oh, my friend is having a hard time. Okay, now my energy has to shift there. And now I'm in a mood of service. I'm in a mood of, compassion. What does compassion even mean? Compassion, when you say passion, in the traditional kind of Latin sense of the word, compassion means to suffer with someone. That doesn't mean that you take on the suffering of others, although sometimes in a very spiritually advanced state, it could even mean that. In the most basic sense, it means that I'm with you while you're suffering. I'm with you, not just physically, empathically. I'm connected. I understand that you are suffering, and I'm here. I'm present with it. So to generate that energy of compassion, it is absolutely opening up kind of one of those wings of that feedback loop, and it changes your physical chemistry. It's changing the way that hormones flow in your body. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to kind of cast aside what's going on for us and hyper focus on someone else, because then that can become something like a codependent relationship or something like that. But the way that you seem to be indicating is it sort of snaps you out of it, right? And then it normalizes for you the fact that you're suffering. Surely it normalizes for the other person the fact that they're suffering. And then you have this experiences, which is what usually takes place like in group therapy or in a 12-step meeting, which is I don't necessarily have to be further along or improved or in a position to teach or whatever. I just get what you're going through. I get it. And by me getting it and you getting it and us sitting together, there's a certain magic that happens, right? That empathic connection kind of comes alive. And that's a starting place of something new. Now the chemistry is new in our body. The energy is new in the room. And that's really, you know, all of a sudden you have opportunity open up. So that can definitely break you out of it. I'm super happy that you shared that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. Thanks for sharing that. I think my wife was mentioning yesterday, one of my friend, like when we speak with others, the amount of challenges they go through, suddenly what all we think we are going through becomes very tiny, and it just snaps you out. So yeah, thanks for sharing that up. Any other questions, thoughts on Zoom? You can unmute or type that in. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I've never had depression as far as I know, but people in my environment do have it. My mother had it after she got a stroke, and then got so much medicine in her body, pumped in by doctors, that she got shingles, and then from there it went all bad. My daughter has it. She has a lot of companions at school, but it doesn't help her get rid of the depression. My question is about the observing. So I said it because it shows that I'm interested in it, but I have no experience. I cannot talk from experience. You talked about observing the depression or the anxiety and validating it. When I get restless, I do something else. I go for a run, or I do. I drop what I'm doing at that time because that's apparently not working well, and so I do something completely different. And I'm also so would you say that exercise and in general also exercise and diet would be helpful next to the things that you already have said? And oh yeah, and there is also a rule in spiritual life that says if you give it attention, it grows. So my approach of going for a run, if I'm feeling restless, is a way of not giving it attention, but doing something completely different. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. It's super insightful, and it's such a testament to your self-knowledge, right? That you know, okay, if I keep focusing on this, I'm going to magnify it. So I need to extract myself, I need to change my environment, and I need to get new chemicals flowing in my body. And I think that that's super genius. I think that many people in helping professions and wellness professions would encourage you and anyone to do something like that. And part of it is because you really are working with your body chemistry, right? When you switch out, for example, cortisol or adrenaline for endorphins, right, which is what's happening when you're running, right? Endorphins are a feel-good hormone. Dopamine, right, which happens when your body experiences reward for a decision well made. Usually, that's how dopamine is supposed to work. Obviously, when we're like scrolling on Instagram, it's like fake dopamine. We haven't done anything worthy of reward, but we're getting the hit. You know, when you go for a run and you're experiencing these chemical changes, what you're doing is you're saying, my body needs to be onboarded. My body needs to be my ally. And I would say that for many people, if not all people, that's actually the jumping off point. There's a sort of old school psychology that says, you know, if you just kind of fix your thoughts, then everything else follows. And it's all well and good until you're dealing with these really heavy problematic thoughts that you can't just switch off or change out. Nowadays, you know, research is coming out that indicates that actually starting from the senses, and actually the Bhagavad Gita supports this, right? Because the Bhagavad Gita says that the problems initiated from contemplating the objects of the senses, right? The problem initiates when I contemplate the objects of the senses. And what happens is I want things out there That creates a desire in me. My desires are not necessarily going to be fulfilled. My desires for happiness, stability, relationships to work out, things to last forever, success, recognition, you know, whatever it is that I'm wanting, right? That's going to become frustrated. Why? Because the material world is not exactly designed to keep me happy long term. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to get angry. There's going to be frustration there. And so kind of the new research that's coming out, especially in terms of somatic healing modalities, right? Healing modalities that onboard the body as an ally, is they're saying, start with the senses. The problem started with the senses. Start with the senses in terms of the reparative work too. So that means get outside, right? Like you were saying, go for a run, do some exercise, eat something that's nourishing, right? I think that we totally downplay in today's society the effect that our food has on our consciousness. What does nourishing, prana-filled, spiritually infused food do for us versus like fast food or leftovers or junk food and so on? So certainly things like that. And you can see, so, you know, if you just take like a Google search of how people's lives have changed by having breakfast at the same time every day, or incorporating exercise, or creating mindful meal times, right? I'm not like multitasking while I'm eating. What to speak of if I take spiritual consciousness and try and fuse that in the process of creating the meal, in the process of honoring the meal, you know, it totally changes the energy. So starting from the body and working inwards, I think is certainly a huge insight. And that would be a place where if you don't have that piece, I don't see how the other stuff would necessarily fall into place. And Bhakti culture kind of supports that. They talk about your food, they talk about what time you wake up in the morning, talk about, you know, the energy that you're exposing yourself to, right? What you consume from the senses inward. So totally, I appreciate that insight so much.
I have one more thing to add to Mark's comment. I'm also a parent, and so it makes me think about when the baby is crying, what do? You take the baby outside, right? You change the environment. And so that's awesome. Mark has been able to keep that tactic through his whole life. And I think sometimes we forget some of these simple tools as we grow up and, right, life gets busy.
Absolutely. That's such a great takeaway. If you take something away from this class today, take the baby outside. I'm the baby. The baby's getting fussy, take the baby outside. Yeah, so change it up, change the environment. I think that's brilliant.
Hi, this is Gokul. Just turn on my video. Anyways, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, hi. Hi. So I just want to share that I have been through depression, and I was put on medication for almost a year, bunch of antidepressants, and I was going through a low time. This was like 3 or 4 years ago, and I've been spiritually involved with ISKCON, and I've been meditating since my teenage years. And I think it was the lowest point in my life when I just decided I'd given up pretty much. I had a pretty bad relationship that didn't work out, and and I think I just at the time when I was at the edge of pretty much giving up on life, there was that part that just silenced everything, and I just told myself, like, I went inside, deep inside myself. I just felt like, hey, you know what? This is me. I mean, this is who I am, with all my vulnerabilities and my fears, and that aspect of acceptance of myself and my fears and acknowledging them actually helped me move forward. And just wanted to share that story. And it took me another year to wean off my medication, and all this while, I grew up, back in India when we were growing up, at least the millennials, right? And depression was not really acknowledged as a problem, and I was continuously being told by my parents, hey, you got to be mentally strong, things don't work out, and you got to just stay strong. Actually, that really didn't help, but the fact that I was able to kind of go deep inside at that moment when I was actually at the verge of giving up, kind of opened some things that I really can't explain, but it just felt accepting your own fears and vulnerabilities. At least that helped me take that step forward. Just wanted to share my story.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. That's it's such a personal and vulnerable thing to have shared. And I think that it's a testament to your fortitude, actually, to be able to accept our suffering is the starting point of the suffering ending, right? Because suffering is compounded by us trying to avoid the suffering, right?
Yeah.
That aversion to suffering is a form of suffering in and of itself, is it not, right? It kind of magnifies the suffering.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. That's super powerful.
Thanks, Gokul. Anyone else? Any other questions, thoughts, reflections? No. So, Dhanya, we have 10 more minutes left. Again, do you have any more things to share, or would you want maybe have a short kirtan? What would you prefer?
Well, one of the things that I did kind of want to share, because I know sometimes it can it can feel a little bit somber to kind of just come in and say, you know, your anxiety and depression make perfect sense. The world is totally chaotic. Material existence is full of suffering. And that's what the yogis think. So I'll see you guys later. Have a wonderful weekend. I hope that you enjoy all the things you have planned, you know, so on. So I don't want to kind of leave it on that note. There's an interesting verse in Bhagavatam, which is the Srimad Bhagavatam is kind of the canon as far as bhakti literature goes, and it's filled with stories that are like so informational, because it's really stories of various different personalities that are suffering and how that suffering happens and how they move through that suffering, specifically from a spiritual perspective. And so one of the things that is mentioned in the Srimad Bhagavatam is that auspiciousness and inauspiciousness is a question of perspective, right? Which is what we were talking about in the Gita, that attachment and aversion have to do with perspective. They're arising from our perception, right? And so Bhagavatam kind of expands that. It backs that up and it expands that. And it says that actually the concepts of something that's auspicious and something that's inauspicious, that's actually concocted, right? Which sounds crazy because there are things that seem innately to be quite unfortunate and other things that seem innately to be quite fortunate, right? I just had a baby. That seems like a fortunate thing. And, you know, earlier this year, my car got crashed into while it was parked. That seems unfortunate. So those kinds of things seem very clear. But Bhagavatam is saying, maybe not. Maybe they're not so clear. Maybe they're concepts, right? It's something that we formulate. And so it's something that I'd like to leave off as maybe a point of reflection, especially as we talk about anxiety and depression, that sometimes anxiety and depression are stemming from circumstances that are outside of our control. These could be family circumstances, these could be societal circumstances, right? It could be trauma. And so it's not to say that these circumstances are not eliciting this emotion, but it's saying they elicit the emotions and what can happen from here. I am anxious, right? As you were just sharing previously, I am anxious, I am depressed. So what happens now, right? So what's considered fortunate could actually be something that could be a source of misery. Has anyone ever experienced? I've experienced that. Something that I thought was amazing ended up kind of making a U-turn and being a horrible situation for me. It happens, right? And then something that is considered inauspicious, something unfortunate, a failure, a loss, a mistake, all of a sudden can transform into some of the best opportunities of my life, not just for personal growth and transformation, but actually in the trajectory of my life, right? Like even when I was sharing my personal story, you know, my university, there was like protests and marches, my classes were canceled, I couldn't continue my university degree, and that ended up being one page in a chapter of my life that brought me closer in terms of my spiritual life to what were my overarching goals, right? But if you take that isolated incident, it was just horrible. It was just awful. There was so much suffering. I suffered so genuinely during that time. So from the yogic perspective, what we want to do is keep this in mind. Yes, I am suffering. I want to be with that. I want to acknowledge that. And in acknowledging that, what is being acknowledged and the person acknowledging have now created some space, right? And now I have the opportunity, only in doing that, only in validating that, have I created enough space to say, maybe this means something. Maybe this thing that I think is really great is not so great and I need to be careful. And maybe this thing that doesn't seem so great is a portal to transformation, is a portal to growth, right? So sometimes I ask my clients, the people that I work with, sometimes I ask them, is it possible that what seems now like an unfortunate event or a difficulty or a challenge, what would happen if this ended up being one of the greatest things to happen to you in your life? What would it take? What would you need to do? Right? This is putting the agency back in your court. This is putting the ball back in your court. What would you need to do to make this one of the best things that ever happened to you? So I wanted that to be a takeaway, because I want to kind of bring it back to the fact that a yogi isn't necessarily optimistic about material life, but they're always optimistic about spiritual life. That any circumstance that's presented to me externally, I have a way of addressing it internally. And there's optimism in that. So I just wanted to kind of leave that off as a question, just to kind of, have as food for thought. The things that are not working out for me in my life right now, what would it take for this to become one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life, as it is, without me changing the circumstance? What would I need to do? What would need to shift internally for me for this to become something amazing in my life, actually? So yeah, I just wanted to kind of put that out there as a concluding thing, so it's not so so full of despair, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for saying a weekend, as you mentioned. Any other questions or reflections? Yeah, I think Mark said that's an awesome thought. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mark. Anything else? Go ahead, Mark. I thought you just came off mute, maybe to share something.
Oh, yeah. Well, I have so much looked back in my life and realized, oh, that wasn't a moment of extreme growth that felt painful. But I've never thought about actually realizing that in the moment itself, right? So here, our guest and teacher proposes to take that in the moment itself and get courage out of that. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a guarantee. I'm not saying that I'm going to take a situation in my life and say, you know what, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm so happy. When you're very spiritually advanced, maybe that does become your knee-jerk reaction. That becomes your new normal, which is to say, and you'll hear people in the Bhakti tradition seemingly thanking divinity for circumstances that are catastrophic, right? Calamitous is maybe a more accurate word. People who are extremely spiritually advanced can see what seems like an unfortunate situation and immediately think, this is actually a blessing. This is a blessing, and it may come in disguise, but I understand that it's a blessing. So what I'm asking us to do is not jump to that, because that may be inauthentic. It's inauthentic for me, for sure. I don't see things that way. It's not like if someone crashed into my car today, like they did earlier, I would immediately go, you know what? Hare Krishna, this is the best thing that could have happened to me today. I'm going to be a better person. It's impossible. It's not, I don't have access to that. But is it possible? Is it possible? And so it's just the question that you pose yourself, and that in and of itself creates some levity in the situation. Is it possible that there's growth somewhere embedded in the situation? Is it possible that a better side of me is going to come out as a result of me dealing with this, however I need to deal with it? So it's very much grounded in real life. It's very much grounded in being in the world and being present, being a problem solver, being attentive. It's really kind of in the now. But it also opens up a little bit of possibility. Is it possible that what seems like an unfortunate or inauspicious situation is actually full of possibility for me? Right? And so just asking ourselves that question, it creates a little spaciousness.
Thanks. Nirali just shared. Thank you. That is right. It seems painful. That is my mind created. Lessons learned, like not to be emotionally attached to other, but it turned me look into my overthinking and image of mine in others to protect, which is unrealistic. I let it go, then only I can be myself.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's a kind of rooting down into our authenticity, right? Really being ourselves.
Yes. Any other last questions? Any other last reflections? We have 1 minute left. Or anything you want to give a gift, Dania, in the last minute?
Well, I just wanted to thank you all so much for your participation. There was so many personal shares, so many people coming forth vulnerably and talking about their personal experiences. And obviously, you know, this is a big topic. We didn't even really get to dive into the mantra portion of the conversation. And so it's so important for these topics to be addressed in spiritual circles and wellness circles, in our self-improvement and transformation environments, to really talk about them openly and to hold a safe space. So just really thanking all the participants for being authentic and coming forth with your own, you know, real experiences and realizations, and also holding space for those who shared. It's really valuable. I think that it's a form of presence that is undervalued, but it's crucial in our spiritual development. So just feeling a lot of gratitude, and also gratitude to yourself, JM, for holding the space and being such an excellent moderator and host. I feel very grateful to you.
No, thank you so much. It was such a wonderful session. I personally learned a lot, and I'm on chat. Lots of messages. Jesse says, lovely session today. Thank you for your time. Would love to continue this conversation in future. Gokul says the same, great session. Thank you for all the knowledge and wisdom. Chari says the same, great session. Wish it was a longer session. That's always a good thing. Thanks for sharing the wisdom. Yeah, lots of thanks pouring in. So thanks so much, Dania, for coming in today and sharing your wisdom, knowledge, and practical tips. It was amazing. And as all are saying, I hope this is just a beginning. We hope to have you more often, and definitely we'll love to learn more with you. So thank you so much for taking your time, making preparation, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Absolutely. Same to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. And Vash always encourages that when we sign off with a transcendental sound vibration, so that we carry that when we leave. So he typically mentions that when he flies through Himalaya, he sees yogis who are in their caves, like how we are here in Zoom. They come out of their caves and they look for roots and fruits. And then when they see one another, they sign off with a sound called Hari Bol, which means keep the transcendental vibration going. So please, everyone, come out of your caves and let's sign off with Hari Bol.
Hari Bol.
Hari
Bol.
Hari Bol.
Hari Bol. Thank you so much, Dania. Thanks again.
Thank
Hari.
you. Have a great day. Bye.